adventure, experience, service. These were more than just words to Dan Eldon. They were pillars upon which he built his life. Born in London in 1970, Dan spent the majority of his life in Africa. The city of Nairobi in Kenya and the neighboring countryside provided an exciting environment that nurtured both his sense of adventure and his artistic inclinations. Cultural tensions divided most of the continent while Dan was growing up. He hated this division of people over insignificant differences and worked tirelessly to demonstrate community among everyone. Whether it was taking a picture with a child or dancing with members of one of the tribes, Dan loved to be part of the action. Through the most exciting times as well as the most horrific, Dan's mentality of safari as a way of life guided him on the adventure. Tragically, Dan's adventure ended in 1993 at the age of 22 when he was killed while on assignment in Somalia. Though young in years, Dan left enough memories and impacted enough people to last for lifetimes. His story has inspired thousands, and it is in his honor that we bring it to you now. Dan received his first journal in 6th grade to document a school field trip. This marked his first exposure to a medium that later became his main creative outlet. By the end of high school, Dan began to work extensively on his own journals, often revisiting old pages and adding different layers to them. Never satisfied with the quality of his photographs, the young artist always looked for ways to enhance the pictures by manipulating them and adding other elements. He experimented with cutting up materials clipped from magazines and newspaper articles and pasting them alongside his own work to create extravagant collages. The pieces were often further decorated with paint or drawings and littered with quotes and written accounts of his adventures. Dan was largely self-taught in terms of his artistic process and vision. However, he was not without influences. Photojournalists Angela Fisher and Carol Beckwith inspired Dan with their work exposing Africa's vanishing cultures. The two gained access to never-before-seen aspects of tribal life through their constant presence with and mutual affection for the African people. Dan would employ similar techniques during his numerous trips across the continent. He also drew from other modes of expression such as art and literature. His classes at the International School of Kenya with teacher Liza McKay introduced him to modern art, and books like The Shock of the New encouraged him to push boundaries in his own work. Books like George Orwell's 1984 raised awareness to the political tensions in Africa and fostered a sense of kinship with the abused and underprivileged people. Dan compiled 17 journals over the course of his life, each bursting with images, insights, and humor. They have since inspired and encouraged many people to explore their own artistic potential. This prolific and unapologetic artwork showcases the power of letting one's unbridled creative energies run wild. As he grew older, Dan ventured farther out into the Kenyan countryside. He would often hitchhike to game parks and coastal areas to visit friends like Kipinget, a Maasai woman and mother of 6 whose jewelry Dan helped to sell. His journals from the time are abundant with images of the native tribes and cultural traditions he witnessed and even at times took part in. After high school, Dan and 2 friends were exposed to a different side of the continent during a lengthy road trip to Victoria Falls, the first of many in Dan's Land Rover Desiree. Their experience was twofold. On the one hand, the youthful exuberance of travel, drinking, pool crashing, and courtship. On the other, the grim realities of war-torn Mozambique and the struggles of the apartheid. Both sets of images would remain with Dan for the rest of his life.
career on began with the discovery of a different sort of wildness in the urban sprawl of New York City, where he interned at a fashion magazine called Mademoiselle. While he was a great success with the staff and enjoyed exploring the new city, the cold, impersonal forest of brick and steel buildings fostered an increasing sense of isolation. In many of his journal entries from that time, images of Kenya merge with the cityscape to mimic Dan's struggle in finding himself and his calling amid the blares and shrieks and radio waves of New York. By Christmas, he was ready to return to Africa. In January 1990, Dan arrived in Southern California to start classes at Pasadena Community College. It was there that he met Iji Shimizu, a Japanese exchange student. After Dan told Iji about the refugees of Malawi, the two came up with the idea of STA, or Student Transport Aid, a program designed to raise money for the refugees. However, Dan and Iji wanted to go to the villages themselves. They began to plan an expedition, inviting many friends along with them. Together they became Team Desiree. In addition to Dan and Iji, the team included 13 other team members. Ranging from ages 16 to 21, they included Dan's sister Amy, future filmmakers Christopher Nolan and Rocco Bellic, and Dan's best friend Lengai Kroze. Together they raised over $20,000 in donations for the people of Malawi. The trip was a grand adventure for the group of young people, though not without various technical mishaps and some personal and romantic tensions along the way. Fortunately, the team developed certain conflict resolution strategies, one being a system of wrenches given out to represent different solutions to their problems, as well as group artistic efforts such as decorating their 2 Land Rovers. Chris and Rocco captured a great deal of footage for the trip. Dan is featured prominently in much of it, whether it be joking with the other team members or interacting with the locals. It is his energy and leadership that helped to make the group's service safari such a success. Desiree was more than just a Land Rover to Dan. She was also his vehicle to uncover and discover new places, adventures, and people further afield than Kenya. The SUV became another canvas for him, which he could cover with stickers, skulls, and paint like his journals at home. Desiree was also part of the Student Transport Aid trip to Mozambique. During that trip, the team raised enough money to donate another Land Rover to the Save the Children Fund, give money to build 2 wells, and buy tools and blankets for the refugees. While the trip was a great success in many ways and profoundly impacted each team member, it also left dark traces in the memories of the young people who experienced the thrill of adventure and service alongside images of hardship and abuse. Dan captured the camp's extreme poverty and other grim sights with his camera, refusing to look the other way when it came to the suffering people. This steadfast approach would serve him well in his next venture, war photographer. Dan practiced safari as a way of life, a concept he derived from the Swahili translation of the word meaning a departure, journey, expedition, or movement. Whether he was taking a weekend trip to the coast or a 1,000-mile trek through southern Africa, Dan made every moment an adventure. Throughout his life, he traveled to more than 40 countries, making his memories into art through his journals. Dan thrived on safaris because they gave him an excuse to be in the world, to explore his environment and meet new people. He made a vow to discover new places, a personal promise sketched out in his mission statement. To explore the unknown and the familiar, distant and near, and to record in detail with the eyes of a child any beauty, horror, irony, traces of utopia or hell. Select your team with care, but when in doubt, take on some new crew and give them a chance. but avoid at all costs fluctuations of sincerity with your best people. In 1988, a civil war broke out in Somalia between tribal leaders and government officials attempting to modernize the country. Mogadishu stood at the center of the conflict. The city was in ruins. The Green Zone, also known as the MOG, was completely destroyed despite its status as a sanctuary for soldiers. Dan captured the severe famine and devastation working as a freelance journalist. He and the other journalists fought their own battles alongside the soldiers to raise awareness about the conflict for the rest of the world. Though the events Dan witnessed in Somalia affected him deeply, even to the point of a dark depression, he never wavered in his effort to expose the war and famine in Mogadishu. American military forces arrived in December 1992, bringing with them aid and expectations of a quick resolution to the fighting. However, little could be done to stop the city's bands of looters, and violence increased. Many journalists soon left the country. As Somalia reached its greatest level of disarray, Dan's professional career was taking off. The 22-year-old had a number of photographs chosen for publications such as Time and Newsweek. On July 12, 1993, several Cobra helicopters attacked a residential area in Mogadishu, mistakenly believing warlord Mohammed Adid was in the area. Instead, the attack resulted in the death of 70 civilians. Dan and his group of colleagues made their way to the area. What they found was a mob of angry Somalians crowded around the rubble. As the journalists explored the blast site, they were unwittingly surrounded by the mob. Then violence broke out. The convoy of vehicles were forced back by the crowd, and the men on the ground were made to run for their lives amid a barrage of stones and bullets. Dan was intercepted by the mob. He fell to his knees, and before he could say anything, he was killed. Dan used his journals to sketch, scribble, snip, and glue his experiences into place. He used them to remember, to think, and to dream. His collection of powerful, multi-layered artwork is the manifestation of how he chose to see the world around him. Dan also created graphic designs, published a book, and directed a short film, all before the age of 22. As a teenager, Dan bought jewelry from Kenyan villagers and helped to sell them in Nairobi. In college, he led a service trip that brought thousands of dollars of aid to a refugee camp in Malawi. As a Reuters photojournalist, he helped to expose the horrors and famine of the Somali Civil War to the rest of the world. Dan spent his life in service of the people he loved. Dan traveled and explored over 40 different countries in his lifetime, places such as London, Mozambique, Japan, Spain, Morocco, Kenya, India, Russia, Germany, and Somalia. He applied his mission statement, Safari as a way of life, to more than just physical travel, however. It also colored his interactions with people, both loved ones and strangers who inevitably became new friends. A creative activist is a person who uses thought or imagination to catalyze positive change in our world. Dan Eldon was a creative activist. He used his mind to conceive change. He used his art to help understand it. He used his camera to show it to all of us. Dan died in 1993 at 22 years old, but his legacy continues.